women who have influence and who have brains and make things happen and change things around them, that doesn't fit with the picture that the woman should be subservient. So if you make her, therefore, evil, then men can say, look what happens when you put a woman in charge.
These women were extraordinary figures of their time.
Important discussions about issues like women's power, women's sexuality.
All these stories about women in the Bible have sex in common.
They have to be recast as evil. They are women who change the world around them.
She's undoubtedly the most famous woman in the Bible. Even the irreligious think they know all about Eve. But much of what we've heard is really just malicious gossip.
I think most people do not know the real Eve, the Eve as presented in the Genesis account, because culturally we have a lot of baggage that we have placed on Eve.
Certainly the history of the interpretation of this story, Eve has taken much of the fall, and in the history of art, you often see Eve portrayed in a very seductive manner. Even the serpent often has a female head. There's this perception of women as evil and seductress.
She's the seductress who tempts Adam with her sexuality in order to make him fall.
So sex is right there, often in the interpretation of the stories, right at the beginning, even though they're not ashamed of their nakedness at this point and presumably are innocent about sex. But the stories have been interpreted still so that she seduces him, which of course is about sex.
But there's no word temptation in the Bible. There's no seduction. There's none of those aspects that tend to cast Eve in a negative light. Eve is not cursed. There's no Satan. There is no sin in the story. The word sin doesn't appear there. It's only in the later interpretations that becomes associated with Eve.
What really happened in the Bible bears little resemblance to the story with which we're most familiar. Adam, the first man, is lonely in the Garden of Eden. God decides to create a companion, a woman from Adam's rib, or so the story goes. But Eve is not content in paradise. When the serpent suggests she try the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Eve goes for it and tempts Adam to take a bite too. They are expelled from the Garden of Eden, and the human journey has been a struggle ever since.
Eve tends to get a bad rap in early Christian literature, in early Jewish literature, and throughout popular culture to this very day. She becomes a symbol of the seductress, the temptress, as the one who is responsible for humankind's fall into sin, for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. That's a very heavy burden to bear.
Some scholars have placed Adam and Eve's home, the Garden of Eden, in what's now southern Iraq, at the confluence of 4 rivers. 3 major religions come together here too.
Genesis 1 to 3 is a tale of origins. And it's not just a tale of origins, it's a sacred tale for people within the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Muslim tradition.
Over centuries, different interpreters added their 2 cents, undoubtedly affected by the times in which they lived.
The story gets reinterpreted, and then that interpretation gets elaborated and emphasized and grows over time, so that you get the women as the devil's gateway, for instance, in Tertullian. And the rest is history, as they say. That theme continues with some permutations and variations and so on. But it becomes very prominent in Augustine, one of the most important church fathers. These earlier interpreters, Paul, Tertullian, Augustine, they set the stage for understanding Eve as a sort of inferior figure to Adam, and therefore women as inferior to men.
In the 17th century, Eve's reputation as a notorious fallen woman was sealed in the epic poem Paradise Lost by John Milton.
He had a very hierarchical view of the universe. God, humanity, animals, and within humanity, the hierarchy meant man, woman, under man. So he has taken that domination theme literally and played it out in his depiction of the first couple.
Milton is fairly kind to her. He doesn't make her an evil character, but he makes her unwise, very easily deceived by argument. Where Adam is heroic in that version. Adam gives himself up and eats the fruit because he loves Eve so much he must have her.
And why is this old story of what happened at the dawn of creation still important? Because for centuries, it has had a profound effect on intimate human relations.
So often when people try to imagine, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? They return to Genesis 1-3, and interpretations of the text therefore have enormous social payoff in our own time, because however we construe these original human beings, we will see them as the model for contemporary human beings.
In today's popular culture, Adam and Eve have also become strikingly secular symbols. Search the internet for references to the first couple, and you'll quickly come upon dating sites that focus on finding your soulmate. That is, if you don't first stumble across sites selling sex toys.
If you Google Adam and Eve, the first hit that you will get is Adam and Eve sex toys. If you were to Google Christian online dating sites or Adam and Eve online dating sites, you'll find all kinds of hits. Some of them really focus on Adam and Eve as soulmates.
But what did Eve actually do to earn such a naughty reputation? In popular mythology, from the moment of creation, it's been downhill for woman's reputation.
The idea that woman is the root of all evil is not something actually found in the Genesis story, but baggage that has been given to her from interpreters who have had issues with women and have projected that onto the account.
Initially, God gave man and woman both the same jobs: to look after every living creature and to be fruitful and multiply themselves.
Genesis provides us with two creation stories. In the first one, male and female are created simultaneously. There is no hierarchical relationship between them. They are both addressed by God.
There's a first human, often identified as Adam, but in fact, the word that's used to translate man at the beginning of the story is a generic term. It's a generic term for a human being. One can make a very strong case for the fact that the first human created by God is gender inclusive or non-gendered, either way you want to look at it. And then there's this cosmic surgery, because God says that there's something wrong. If there's only one of these things, there need to be a pair, because God understands that procreation comes through copulation, so you need a matched pair.
It's in the second story that woman is created from man's rib. And things get ticklish.
If you just read that story on the surface level, it really does seem that woman is created to meet the male need for companionship. And she is then created out of a part of his body. And from that has been derived a social structure in which male are seen as dominant and women as subordinate.
It's at that point that we really start to see the kind of gender politics of the biblical text coming through. So Eve there will now be responsible for things that I suppose the first writer in the first story really wasn't interested in. That story is about order and creation and beauty and perfection. The second story is about humanity in all of its muddy intricacies, all of the things that can go right and all of the things that can go wrong.
The text actually says that the woman is made as a helper to the man. But calling the woman a helper doesn't necessarily indicate that she has a subordinate role.
By the time Milton wrote Paradise Lost in the 17th century, the word rib remained as the part of Adam from which his mate was created. The ancient meaning of rib had been lost.
Another misconception is that there's a rib involved, that a rib is taken out of the side of the first human being. But in fact, that word probably should be translated side.
Of course, that would make Eve separate but equal. Definitely not the popular interpretation in Milton's 17th century and beyond. Not one to let the facts get in the way of a good story. Milton embellished the story with detail that simply isn't there in the Bible. Like that Eve convinces a reluctant Adam to work in separate areas of the garden, leaving her alone when the snake approaches.
Most readers approaching this story don't realize that Adam is standing next to Eve during the whole episode with the snake or serpent. Biblical narrative, just the literary style of Hebrew narrative, always only has two people talking at once. So it's been misinterpreted as somehow Adam gets bewitched or beguiled or seduced by Eve and isn't a full aware partner knowing what's going on. But he is. He's standing next to Eve the whole time.
We all know what happened after Eve met the snake. Or do we? When Eve tempted Adam with that apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she got them booted out of paradise forever. And ever since, women have been trying to shake the image of the seductive bad girl who needs the strong hand of a good man to set her straight. But none of that's in the Bible. The Bible doesn't even name the famous fruit. Eve might have handed Adam a pear for all we know.
So the question is, how does the apple get into the picture in the first place? It comes from the Latin translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and then the play on words with the Latin word malum, which means apple, but it also means evil. And so that's how you kind of get that cluster of images around the apple.
So that's one of the ways in which we know that ideas that developed about the story long after the story took its final shape have been kind of superimposed on the story, so that without going back to look at what's actually there, people think they know what's there.
The snake did choose Eve to approach with the offer of fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
The snake approaches her, not the man. Presumably, like most women, she's more vocal, more articulate, and it makes more sense to have for those kinds of reasons, not because she's gullible or stupid or prone to evil, but simply because she's a better dialogue partner. And of course, she ends up saying, yeah, it's a good idea, I better have some of that. And she takes the fruit and gives some to the man, and he eats too. One of the things that's really interesting about that scene is that she's really the active, dynamic character.
The serpent plays on Eve's curiosity.
What the biblical story shows is Eve as someone searching for knowledge and wisdom. And that's the temptation that the serpent places before her, to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge that is enticing her, and that the serpent assures her will come to her if she eats of this fruit. That's what attracts her.
And then, so generations have been taught, Eve tempts Adam with the fruit.
Oh, does Eve trick Adam? No. No, Eve does not trick Adam. Eve simply says, here's some fruit, and he eats it. So there is no trickery.
And the fact that he has no protest, doesn't say, wait a minute, hold on, is seen as something that is very telling, and perhaps the reason why when God comes looking for them in the garden, he calls out to Adam first.
In antiquity, writers tried to fill in that gap by suggesting things. They suggested that she nagged him, that she said she wouldn't sleep with him again, all sorts of things, that she cried. Tears are woman's arsenal, that she cried, and finally he was persuaded to eat. Actually, the text never says anything like that. There's just a really big gap. She hands it to him, he eats.
So they ate, and now had knowledge of good and evil that previously belonged only to God. When God challenges them, it's nobody's finest hour.
God seemed to be angry at the disobedience of the couple. Adam, first of all. It's Adam whom God first addresses, and then Adam passes it off to Eve, of course.
I think the biblical story does not portray her as an evil person. It assigns some measure of responsibility to the serpent and shows Adam as a gullible, passive individual. She says, eat, and he eats. And then he tries to blame her, and she blames the snake, and they all get kicked out and given certain punishments.
Now the first humans will be expelled from paradise, to stop them from also eating of the tree of life and gaining immortality too.
Well, isn't that kind of mean? And I'll say, well, look when the expulsion comes. It's after all of the punishments. Would you really like to live forever, given all of the things that you're just told is going to happen to you?
Even if it wasn't Eve's fault that the world's first couple got kicked out of paradise, life on the outside is tough. And maybe that's the point of the story. Life is tough.
And so it tells us, why do people work? Why do people have pain in childbirth? You know, it gives reasons for that. And those reasons are that the humans didn't obey God.
This story is a way of helping Israelites cope with the reality of their lives. The reality of their lives is how to survive in a rather uncongenial environment. They were agriculturalists, but soils were poor, rainfall was very erratic. There were 3 out of 20 years there were droughts. Famine was recurrent. Hunger was common. Work was very hard. How were they to understand that kind of reality? And so a story emerges, as it does for peoples across cultures. Why are things the way they are?
According to some Bible scholars, the idea of man's mastery over woman has been wrongly generalized from a very specific need of ancient times, for more children.
The infant mortality rate was such that most women would have had to bear twice as many children as they wanted to have living children. So the sexuality in here is the man's call. The wife doesn't get to say, "I'm sorry, dear, I'm too tired tonight," basically is what that's all about. The dominion is not a general social dominion. It's in keeping with the theme of that one verse, that a woman has to have multiple pregnancies. She will be turning towards her husband, and he has to have the right to have sex with her whenever it's the time. And this is not about general dominion.
Some feminist scholars have gone further, claiming Eve as the mother of science.
Well, this is what some women, feminist scholars have argued. Since we are going to be accused of eating of the tree, and the emphasis is going to be on us, which is not biblical, but since it's going to take place, then we're going to appropriate that term and say, okay, if we're the ones who ate of the fruit of the tree, then aren't we the source of all knowledge? Aren't we the source of reason? Aren't we the first scientists?
The lesson for modern man, Christian or not, may be in contemplating the consequences of our choices. When we put our own desires and ambition above living in harmony with the natural world.
In Genesis 1 and 2, even though we have two distinct creation stories, they do have some similarity. And that similarity, I think, is founded on the idea that this is the way things were. There was once a time when there was no predator or prey. Humans basically lived in harmony with their environment, but also in harmony with each other. And then with Genesis 3, what happens is everything falls apart. All of the harmonious relationships that you have in Genesis 1 and 2 are now fractured, including the relationship between humankind and God.
Far from being the temptress who caused the fall of man, Eve can now be seen as simply one half of the couple who initiated the human